Well, good afternoon and welcome to the final webinar in the British Chamber of Commerce series around the TCA and the new trading relationship with the EU. Following on really successful webinars where we've looked at some discrete and very knotty issues like rules of origin, VAT, services, data and the like, we're going to try and turn away from a close textual scrutiny of the several thousand pages of the TCA, etc., and wheel out our crystal balls and try and think a little bit more clearly today about what the future holds. We are now just over 2 months into the new trading relationship. Some things have gone well, some things have gone less well, but what do we think the future holds? And so we have an absolutely stellar panel today. I'll introduce them all in a second, but we have a really valuable set of perspectives from within the UK, from a foot on both sides, and from Belgium looking back, and so it should be absolutely fascinating. Just a few bits of housekeeping. Please do put your questions into the box. We will do our best to give them to the panelists once they start talking. Obviously, the sharper and the meaner, the better. That's always the drill on these things. I will moderate. We've been inundated with questions in the past, which has been really refreshing, but has meant we can't deal with all of them, I'm afraid. But we'll do our best to get to them and point everybody in sensible sources of direction. I would also say that we're going to put this webinar on the YouTube. If you're watching that on the YouTube, that's very impressively technical of you. I'm not sure I could quite manage it these days. But one of the points to note is this is such a fast moving field that things may have changed a little bit by tomorrow, let alone in a couple of weeks' time. So this all comes with a bit of a heavy dose of salt. We're comfortable that we have such an expert panel. We will get things very sensibly correct today, but obviously the details can shift a little bit as we move forward. So I just want to welcome everyone again as the guests of the 53 accredited chambers in the UK and the many, many more who form our global business network. You're very welcome. And mentioning the Global Business Network, I'm going to come to our first panelist in turn. He is chair of our British chambers in Belgium and an ex-MEP in his own right. So Daniel, over to you. Views on building on the trade relationships, please.
Thank you, James, and thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is, of course, the deal itself in trade terms is quite a groundbreaking deal in terms of the fact that there are no tariffs on goods that are produced in the UK across the board. Now, that's quite, in pure trade terms, that's quite a significant deal. However, I think as you're all becoming aware of, the real issue with trade is not necessarily tariffs itself. It is the non-tariff barriers that that govern the access to the market. And certainly what we're seeing is a significant amount of troubles with these non-tariff barriers, and also with things like rules of origin because of the way the UK economy had generally been set up. So that means although it's quite good for goods as a whole, for services, there's very little in the deal. And I think where we're likely to go in the future on this is difficult to say. However, built into the deal, there is a framework to allow new modifications to the deal, to build onto the deal in a number of different areas. What is stopping that happening is not necessarily what's in the deal, but the politics of the situation at the moment. And of course, there are significant political challenges in the relationship between the EU and the UK at the moment. Right at the moment, today, we're seeing one of them playing out with the vaccines, but also the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is causing some significant challenges. And so I would just say, maybe before we go on to questions later at this stage, for me, the Northern Ireland Protocol is probably the key to the future of this agreement. How that plays out, really, we don't know. I mean, it could go in a number of different ways. It could blow up the whole relationship, but it could also open up the doors to possibly some closer relationship, particularly on some of the SPS issues, that's sort of phytosanitary food, animal health standards. That to me is going to be the key. There are obviously, I think, some potential on services to move, because we haven't really seen the impact on services and the movement of people yet because of COVID, and that will start developing, I think, as people start traveling again. But I'll probably leave it at that because we've only got 3 minutes now, but looking forward to the Q&A later. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you, Daniel. That's really handy. I think covering the history, past and present of Northern Ireland in 3 minutes is an incredible achievement as it stands. So that's excellent work. And then now we come to our second panelist, who is Dr. Adam Marshall. I'm sure many of you know him. He is the Director General of the British Chambers of Commerce, which most importantly, of course, makes him my boss's boss as we hit end-year review time. So Adam, over to you for your, I'm sure it will be incredibly profound and apposite initial views, please.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, James, and good afternoon, everybody. In my view, Her Majesty's government and the European Council and the European Commission now really face a choice. Either they see the deal, the TCA, as the sum of their mutual ambitions, or they see it as a foundation on which to build for the future in the common interests of both the United Kingdom and the European Union. My hope very much is that it becomes a foundation on which to build. And the analogy that I like to use is a bit like the base of a Lego sculpture. You've got one of those green sheets at the bottom of your Lego sculpture. That's the TCA. And you put brick after brick on top of it to get to a final creation. And I would very much like the TCA to be that foundation rather than the sum of mutual ambition. Sadly, as Dan has pointed out already, I think the mood music at the moment suggests real limitations on my desired outcome, i.e., a building relationship over time. And I think business communities all around the UK and British business communities overseas as well are very concerned by what they're seeing. They're noticing the prominence of peacocks rather than pragmatics. They're looking at row after row, some of it played out all across the press, of course, and undermining confidence. And that in turn has an impact on business confidence as well. If, as is my hope, this phase of politicking can be brought to an end, I think there are a number of obvious priorities where building on the TCA would be a win-win for both sides. One, financial services equivalence, obviously an EU decision still to be taken, but one which has important consequences for the UK. The second, the mutual recognition of professional qualifications, which is a really huge non-tariff barrier that will impact quite a lot when we can return to normal business travel. The third is around mobility reservations and some of the mobility restrictions that have come into force. Even though the TCA does have some mobility provisions, of course, they're very incomplete. And reading through the 50 or 60 pages of member state reservations around mobility, I think potentially a surprise for a lot of people. The fourth, for manufacturers, mutual recognition agreement around conformity assessment, something that, of course, the EU has with a number of other countries with which it has a trade deal. Dan mentioned previously SPS, agri-food checks and things like that. A lighter touch regime there should be within our reach. And so too should greater customs facilitations to streamline some of the procedures that are available, get a single window in place and harmonize some of the documentation that's already required. So I think it's striking that both sides recognize that going further would be of mutual economic benefit, but with the current mood music, neither seems particularly interested in coming to the table in the short term. And it's us in the business community ultimately that see the impact. So we see broken supply chains. We see businesses losing or leaving entire markets out of frustration. We see the higher costs of bureaucracy and the impact on business decisions and margins. So whilst some of what we've been seeing is genuine adjustment difficulties, some of it is also structural and permanent in nature. Hence my desire to see some goodwill from both sides and a desire to enhance rather than to constrain their ambition for cooperation. So James, on that note, I think I'll hand back to you and I look forward to Charles's comments and to the discussion.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Adam. Lego, Peacock, and building up from the foundations. I tour de force as always. And finally, we come to our third panelist, Charles Grant, who is the director of the Centre CER, and also, I note, a companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, commonly known in FCO parlance as Call Me God. Charles, your views on where we might go from here, please.
Thank you, James. I agree with everything that Daniel and Adam said. Let me focus mainly on the Northern Ireland Protocol in my 3 to 4 minutes. On Christmas Eve, I was genuinely unsure what kind of relationship the UK would have with the EU for the next few years. Would it be one of a constructive relationship whereby people try to build on the base of the TCA and improve it in various respects in the way that Adam has outlined? Or would we actually be heading for a cantankerous, antagonistic relationship built around litigation and everybody blaming each other for the problems? I'm afraid it's almost certainly now, we know that for the next couple of years at least, we're heading for the latter. I think David Frost's appointment to the job of European Supremo really is a very clear signal from the government to our European partners what kind of relationship we're going to have. I mean, David Frost has form on this. It was he who, in the autumn of 2019, favoured the so-called alternative arrangements for the Irish border. He was against, he thought you could have a proper border between the north and south of Ireland with high technology, meaning that there'd be minimal constraints on trade, minimum friction. And then Boris Johnson went for his walk with Leo Varadkar in Cheshire in the autumn of 2019 and decided to go for what has become the Northern Ireland Protocol with the border down the Irish Sea instead. But David Frost was overruled and therefore had to accept this border in the Irish Sea. At least that's what I'm told by some negotiators. And then last autumn, it was David Frost as one of the people alongside Cummings who is said to be behind the internal market bill, which for a while made it look like the UK was going to overrule the withdrawal agreement and disregard certain aspects of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So as far as I can see, David Frost never really believed in the Northern Ireland Protocol. I think that's probably the Prime Minister's position too, because the Prime Minister has persistently said again and again, there will not be controls on goods passing across the Irish Sea. He said it on a number of occasions, although his officials know that the Northern Ireland Protocol says the contrary. So therefore, I think from the EU point of view now, what I'm hearing when I talk to people in Brussels is they think the government wants to find an excuse for tearing up the protocol, which is going to lead to awful problems. We already have litigation beginning. When I talk to the EU side, I hear anger, I hear frustration, and I hear the Commission telling me that the 27 are pushing them to be tougher all the time. But the thing to remember, though, it's not a priority for the EU, the Brexit business, however important it seems to us taking part in this call. I mean, the EU is far more focused on COVID and the recovery fund, so it's not engaging the top leaders very much at the moment. As regards when they do engage, their line is, we must protect the integrity of the single market. They think that the UK's decision to extend the grace periods on the Northern Ireland Protocol for goods crossing across the Irish Sea means there's a hole in the single market, and the wicked British will exploit this hole and flood the single market with lots of cheap goods that don't comply with EU restrictions, EU rules and regulations. They don't really see that actually, for better or worse, the British government, to be fair to it, is actually concerned about the peace process in Northern Ireland. The British government is right to say, in my view, that the Northern Ireland Protocol, as it's currently devised, does breach the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement, which says that the constitutional arrangements in Northern Ireland should not be altered without the consent of both communities, and the unionist community, or many parts of it, do not consent to this. So the government is not completely without reason in what it says on the protocol, but very few people in Brussels realise that. Now, the result of this very cantankerous relationship that is now emerging is, I'm afraid, the goodwill has been lost. The UK side doesn't really trust the UK side. That's what they say to me again and again. We just don't trust the UK. And because there's a lack of trust and there's a lack of goodwill, I think that'll affect the relationship quite badly for the next few years. And some of the areas that Adam mentioned, I mean, financial services equivalent, we depend on the goodwill of the EU to achieve that. I don't think we're going to get it. Data adequacy, I hope we get that, because it would hurt the EU if we don't, but I'm not certain. Easements for the Northern Ireland Protocol, willingness to improve the details of the TCA in the various ways that Adam outlined. I don't think we have that goodwill at the moment. So to conclude, what is the way forward? Well, I think we do need a way forward, because the Northern Ireland Protocol business will probably get worse, not better, because as rules diverge, both the UK rules will diverge from EU rules, and the EU may introduce new rules. That'll mean that the need for checks and controls on goods crossing the Irish Sea will actually become greater rather than less. So what do we do for the way forward? I think both sides need to change their attitude. The EU side needs to understand this is about the peace process. It's about real easements required to make life easier for people who live in Northern Ireland. It's not about the wicked British trying to sneak through the back door into the single market. This is actually about the peace process. And they need to, some people on the EU side do understand that, but not everybody understands that. On the UK side, you just have to understand that you need to show you're committed to the Northern Ireland Protocol, because many people I talk to on the EU side think the British are not committed to the Northern Ireland Protocol. They're just looking for an excuse to tear it up. So the British have to show that they respect the rule of law, that they will follow the protocol and try and look for ways of making it work. And if they can do that, then I think the EU will agree to easements. They will agree to not change the fundamentals of it, but they'll agree to interpret it in an easier way to reduce some of the friction at the border. And as several people, I think both Adam and Dan have said, an agreement on SPS would be very helpful. I've heard on the EU side it said that Michael Gove was discussing with Šefčovič an agreement by which for 2 years, both the UK would agree not to change its plant and animal health rules. If the UK would agree to that, then the EU would agree to reduce the checks at the border. That would be a good start, I think. Maybe some committee is needed so that both sides can signal future rules, new regulations that would increase the divergence before they happen. And then I think in the long run, if there's a greater atmosphere of trust and goodwill between the two sides, then we can actually improve the terms of the TCA. I mean, I'll just end with one sentence. The EU is quite annoyed that there's nothing in the TCA about security cooperation. There's nothing, at least on foreign and defence policy at all. The EU would like us to be plugged into their machinery on foreign and defence policy. Boris Johnson and David Frost decided not to go with that. I think if we were to offer to plug ourselves back in, not to be members of the EU, of course, but just to have a consultation mechanism on foreign and defence policy, that would be something the EU wants from us. And then in return, they might agree to some easements on the TCA of the sorts that Adam outlined. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Oh, fabulous, Charles. Thank you. That's a really useful analysis of the piece, and I think it puts Northern Ireland beautifully in the centre ground as an issue in its own right, and also in the context of the wider relationship and issue. So thank you. That's really helpful. For the first question, I'm actually going to come to Dan and slightly move a bit. We've heard a lot about Northern Ireland there, which is one of the sources of distrust. I think the other one we've kind of identified is around vaccines and vaccine nationalism, arguably. From the signals you're getting in Belgium, how big an issue is the vaccines, and how big a destroyer of trust is that, rightly or wrongly? And I think we probably all have our views on who's probably in the right on this one.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a destroyer of goodwill. I think that's the problem with the vaccines. I mean, the difficulty here is, I think both the UK and the US negotiated deals that basically ensured that they got supplies first, and the EU didn't negotiate that deal. It didn't really include that in its deal. And as a result, there's a feeling that within Europe, there's a feeling that the UK and the US are not playing by the rules. And I think that's what started the whole of this spiraling out of control. And we've got to the situation where we are today. Now, I think, the end result of this will be, I suspect that this will be a short-term block on the AstraZeneca vaccine. I think before long it will be back being used in Europe. The problem is that Europe, is still in the middle of its latest wave of COVID. Very few people have been vaccinated across most of Europe, and I think they see that continual headlines from the UK about large numbers of people being vaccinated, potential that we're going to open up. And, even, for example, when the Euros come, when the games are in the UK, you might have fans in those grounds, which is not probably going to happen anywhere around Europe. So I think there's a bit of ill will. There's a little bit of jealousy from there as well. And there's also the difficulty that, of course, this is portrayed or seen in the EU as the UK government, making it very clearly that this is a benefit of Brexit. And I think that reacts quite strongly in the EU, because from the EU perspective, the big thing that's always worried the European Union from the start is that the UK would leave the EU and become a success, be a big success from it. On the first big real geopolitical issue that we're seeing now, the UK seems to be quite successful. So I think that all ties into the fact that there's no goodwill on this. And that's also tying into, I think, the things that Charles mentioned on the protocol and on the other sort of spats that we're having in the other areas.
Fabulous, Dan. That's really helpful. I think there's a really good point in there, isn't there, about, Brexit's almost happened too late to affect the vaccine rollout. I think it's clear, the vaccines were agreed by the regulators under the existing regime. It's that sense of presentation which is really not helping to build the trust, but is being played for. And Adam, I might take that point to you, if that's okay. And you talked memorably, as always, about peacocking and trying to be seen to own the wins, even if they're not that linked. How destructive do you think that tendency might be if taken too forward? Do you think that's one of those things that absolutely will stop us from taking the TCA as a starting point, the kind of sticking plaster one might negotiate in a year rather than an 8-year trade deal as one would normally anticipate?
Well, you know, as I've often said in these sorts of delicate international discussions, the way you communicate is often as important as what you communicate. And unfortunately, and I'm sure Charles can attest to this for far more than I can, the UK has been tone deaf to how comments meant for the domestic market here are received in Europe for many decades now. I think that problem has worsened. And I have visibly winced on a number of occasions in recent months or recent weeks when things that happen in the UK are being positioned in a certain way, whether it's the phrase benefit of Brexit that you used before, or you know, compare us to our European friends across the water, et cetera, et cetera. We cannot underestimate the potential for poor communication or loose words to undermine the trust that could be built up over the coming months and years, and that is so necessary to getting some of those changes to the TCA. And on this front, I would say neither side is without sin, but the UK has been at it sinning far more and for far longer.
Thank you, Adam. I think that's very fair. My mind goes back to Trafalgar, but I suspect that the current line might be a wee bit shorter. Charles, and over to you. And so I think we've identified that there are a couple of touchstone issues which are breaking down trust, under which is failure of communications, and in fact, arguably successful communications, but aimed at the wrong end and without a sense of the destruction they're wreaking elsewhere. You talked to the, I suppose, two questions really, actually, if that's okay. One, what's your sense from the European side about whether it is seen as the UK or this particular political establishment? And two, by which I don't mean a particular party, but I mean the overall narrative around this. And two, how likely do you think that that is to go away? Do you think that the Europeans are going to want to play their own domestic audience around this, or do you think we might be in a position where they're willing to pull out of this tailspin?
I think the majority view in the EU would still be, if only the UK would behave as they would put it in a grown-up way, then we will do so as well. I think the Commission, certainly, the Commission also, after all, believes in making the deal work. The Commission wants to make everything work. It's very pragmatic in its bones, its DNA. The Commission is not the problem. The problem is some of the member states. I mean, the French have always been the hardest of the hard on Brexit, and they are still the hardest of the hard. And they are the people who see mercantilist opportunities in Brexit. They see Brexit as, I mean, when I travel around, or I used to travel before COVID, travel around European capitals, everybody I met thought Brexit was really bad for the EU, except for in Paris, where some people thought it was bad and some people thought it was good, because you could use it as an opportunity to grab bits of financial services business, bits of aerospace business, bits of satellite business, whatever, technology businesses. So I think the French have a problem with Le Pen, who's coming up for the French elections in just over a year from now. And I think Emmanuel Macron is very keen to show that Brexit hurts. The French do not want the British system to collapse. That would not be good for France or anybody, but they want it to hurt a bit, but not too much. They want it to hurt enough so that French voters can see leaving the EU is a really bad idea. And the Dutch voters can see the same thing in the Dutch elections, which are happening as we speak. So I think the French have always had an element of, well, Brexit must be seen to hurt. And that's other countries don't take that line. But to be fair to them, the EU's kept, despite these tensions between the French being tougher and so the Irish being softer, they've kept together. But on the Irish protocol business, the Irish are the people we need to listen to. And I think the best hope for common sense says the Irish are the people who will be victims of any problems. If the protocol collapses, nobody's going to be more upset than the Dublin government. And so I think that I'm relying to some extent on the Irish to persuade their European partners to agree to easements so that the protocol can work better, if and when the British are prepared to play that game. But to answer your first question, I think of course they blame the EU side sees the Tory government as the problem, but because the Tory government's been in power for more than 10 years, they've forgotten there are other people in Britain who take a different view. And I think, I mean, they do know Keir Starmer, they like Keir Starmer, but the fact that Keir Starmer is not talking about Europe at all for reasons where we can understand, means that they rather focus on the Tory government as representing the UK at the moment.
Fabulous. Thank you, Charles. And I suppose on the Article 16 activation, which never was, it's a bit of a shock when it turned out that Ireland may have been a step behind being informed rather than a step ahead, which I think shows some interesting points. Now that's really incredibly helpful. Thank you all three. I'm going to move on to some slightly more practical issues now. And Dan, one of the areas we've talked about is financial services, and Adam clearly sees that as one of the areas where things need to be built up a bit. I think in London, we all see that. UK's economy was at least 80% services based. Is there an appetite to do the deal, maybe outside of France? Is that seen as a win-win and build up from there that you're hearing, or actually is it not quite seen in that same light?
I'm not seeing too much positive movement on the financial services. I mean, the EU is still debating and deciding whether they're going to give adequacy to the UK in a number of financial services areas. Now, I think there are some areas specific areas where there may be adequacy given, and that will obviously be presented as maybe more than actually it is, because over the whole sort of sector, I think the EU is trying to get itself in a position where it can move itself away from reliance on the UK financial services sector ultimately. I mean, that to me is a challenging area. Now, just data adequacy, just to let Charles know, I think the EU have, the Commission have announced that they will grant data adequacy for the UK, but financial services is, I think, going to be a lot longer away. And I actually just answered, I think, one of the questions on this, where I think it's difficult from the EU because there are many EU businesses that are reliant on getting capital out of London, getting insurance services out of London because of the size of the city, and that's going to hurt the European Union economy as a whole if they're completely cut off. So I think that's where there is some potential from the EU side to do something on financial services, but they're also aware of how a bigger part of the UK economy it is, and how anything they give is going to be very small, because they don't want to give the UK that unfair advantage in the single market in services that they feel they may well give if the UK has financial services adequacy, and then moves also to change the law in some of its areas, which already I think the government is looking at.
Hey, fabulous, thank you, Dan. I was slightly hoping for a different answer, but I think that probably rings very true, alas. And Adam, if I might come to you, one of the potential benefits, I suppose, that Brexit, the TCA, etc., bring up is around regulation, and we've heard different stories around regulation and what have you. And are there all sorts of areas of law where either the UK is gold-plated, or the perfidious Brussels mafia has made us do all sorts of things so we can't have the bananas we like, the right kind of cucumbers, shoelaces, etc., etc. I have to admit, I'm privately a little doubtful around this, but I'd be really interested to hear your views around regulation and whether actually that is a live thing, or whether it's as fraught with difficulties as it is potential.
I'm always intrigued by this issue, James, because in the political arena at Westminster, you can't move for people who tell you that now is the time for us to address the regulatory thicket, etc., etc. You then go to the industrial estates of the country, the offices, and everywhere else, and what you're told is that the stock of regulation that is currently on the books is pretty far down businesses' priority lists. Which of course are topped by the pandemic, the immediate trade consequences of departure from the single market and the customs union, and many other factors besides. So regulation has its political moment in the sun, but it is often not a massive business priority unless it is oppressive. And what a lot of companies say to us is that everything that I have adjusted to over time, that is sunk cost. I'm used to it, I know what I'm doing, and the thing that would bother me right now is changing regulation at all, whether to reduce it or to increase it, because then I face more adjustment costs at precisely the time when my staff and my resources financially are at their most constrained, because I'm trying to recover from the pandemic. Now, my view on this looking forward is we should not be going on some sort of tilting at windmills for European regulations that must be stripped back in the UK. What we need to do is to focus our efforts on the new and emerging sectors of the economy, whether it's things like health tech and fintech, for example, or others, where the UK could design the world's best regulatory environment to attract companies, to grow them here, to bring in the investment, and then to become a world leader. The agility of this jurisdiction on regulation is about the future. It's not about the past. So I really hope we don't go back to fighting old battles, because it's really boring, number one. And number two, most businesses, with some very, very small and limited specific exceptions, aren't interested.
No, thank you. That certainly rings true from the discussions we're having. It's more a please don't rather than a please do. And Charles, is there a sense from your perspective of where the EU is most concerned about the UK in terms of new and developing areas, where we might be able to compete a little more strongly if we take a sensible approach to regulation? Or is actually the thinking not quite in that space and they're more about the big political issues at this stage?
I think there is a fear of the UK. There's a sort of paranoia that the UK will become a kind of Singapore on Thames with light touch regulation, low taxation, even lower than the Irish taxes, with lots of, they know that, there are some elements in place. Britain does have a very successful venture capital industry, bigger than that of most continental countries, for example. It does very well in life sciences. So there is a sort of, part of this fear is based on truth. We're good at certain things like life sciences and venture capital. Part of it is based on just figments of their imagination, the idea that we're going to cut our social environmental rules and cut our taxes to become a Southeast Asian tiger, which of course is just politically unrealistic. So I think there is a genuine fear of the UK. So it's not just French mercantilism driving European thinking, it's also genuine fear that we'll do rather well. I think my own view is the single biggest criticism I make of the EU in the Brexit negotiations is all the stuff on the level playing field. I mean, even if it was true that the British were trying to create an alternative economic model, which I don't think is true, it surely actually, if the EU was more self-confident, it'd be quite glad to have a competitor on its fringes, somebody giving it some competition, spurring it to perform better itself. The EU does seem a bit reluctant to see competition on its frontiers, which I think is rather a shame. I think it should be more self-confident. I think there's a lot going for the European social economic model, but they shouldn't worry. They shouldn't worry about their own ability to survive. They will survive quite well without. And if the British are doing well on just off the edge of Europe, well, that's even better for them. They can learn from our example in many areas. Just to come back on one area, the thing that Daniel mentioned a moment ago. Daniel's right, of course, on data adequacy, but I still worry about data. I worry a lot because our standards are, they've said we're adequate for now, but the European Commission or the European Court of Justice can strike down that data adequacy ruling without much notice. If there's another case before the European Court, like the Schrems case, we've seen similar to that we've seen in the past. If somebody goes to the European Court of Justice and says British rules on data adequacy do not reflect the GDPR sufficiently well, and a recent ECJ ruling did actually say last autumn that our security services do not comply with the GDPR, then the court can strike it down. So I think we shouldn't, given that the British government, as far as I know, wishes to diverge on data rules. Certainly Cummings did a lot when he was in power. And now that Cummings has gone, there may be less strong desire to do that. But certainly there are people in the London government today who want to diverge, who think will be better for our new high-tech industries and fintech if we do diverge. And given that the European Parliament has very strong views on this, and the people in the German Parliament have very strong views on this, I do think looking a few years down the road, so a divergence on data is an accident waiting to happen, and we could easily lose that data adequacy.
Thank you, Charles. I think that's a good point. I from memory, I believe some of the litigation around Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act is actually inspired by David Davis, noted
yes,
I think original DIT secretary. Dan, I'm going to ask you two things. One is, I suppose, any sense of the assessment of that risk around the adequacy decision proving to be a bit hollow. And then I'm going to ask you a second question around the views of Belgian businesses, if that's okay, and how they're coping. But I just wondered if you wanted to say anything on the data point at this stage.
Yeah, well, I think Charles is absolutely right in his analysis there. I mean, the reality is that the deal will get challenged in the courts, and it almost certainly will get struck down by the European courts at some stage, because the reasons that the US Privacy Shield was struck down are actually very similar to the concerns that they have with the UK. So it's almost certain that that's what will happen. Now, the EU has a problem both with the US and the UK, because the Commission wants these adequacy agreements. It's negotiated the US one twice, and they've been struck down by the courts twice. And the real challenge is many EU countries have similar investigatory sort of powers themselves, but they're covered within the EU. That gives them cover and effectively a derogation from the GDPR from it. As a third country, you don't have that. Now, this is an ongoing sort of thing that's going to go on for quite a long time. What we hope is that the European Commission will try and find a way to come up with something that is legally robust longer term for all third countries. The reality is, from the European Parliament and certainly the people that are pushing for the UK to lose adequacy, is they also want the EU countries not to have the ability to have some sort of investigatory powers type of act domestically within Europe. Their view is, it's a pure privacy issue, and that will align the EU with third countries from there. So to be honest, this is a mess. This is going to go on for a long time. I think companies have to, in the US case, they've still been able to use standard contractual clauses. Now they're not perfect, but at the moment, I think most companies need to keep one eye on this and understanding that they may well not be able to rely on adequacy going forward.
Thank you, Dan. I think that's right. I think the best description of the situation is a mess. One where there are workarounds, but somewhere there is a sword of Damocles above us all, given where modern commerce is going. Just going to move slightly off data and back to the tangibles a little bit, and your membership and the Belgian companies who talk to you. What's their view of all this? Are they seeing the problems? Are they having issues around cost and delays of haulage, et cetera, or actually are the lack of controls, the UK government has, I think for very sensible reasons, postponed the imposition of controls. Is that actually making their life considerably easier than UK firms tell us theirs is when they try and export to the EU?
That very much so. I mean, I think in January and February, figures I got from the Flanders Association in Belgium, who basically deal with the ports, was that 80% of the paperwork and customs declarations from UK imports was wrong. And only 14% of Belgian companies export certificates to go into the UK were wrong. So that, first of all, I think shows the discrepancy a little bit. From the Belgium side, there's less difficulty getting into the UK market at the moment. Now that, of course, is likely to change when the full regime does come into force. Generally in Belgium, the feeling we're getting from our membership is that they're quite excited about this, because there are, of course, lots of British companies now who are looking for an EU establishment or for some sort of warehousing distribution hubs within the EU, and Belgium is quite a attractive destination for that, given its locality. So generally, I think at the moment we're at that stage in Belgium. I think when the full customs regime does finally come in the UK, I think then we'll see some more problems, and that might actually then be a chance to look more about how bilaterally we can solve some of this customs facilitation stuff, and also with the EU.
Fantastic, thank you, Daniel. That's incredibly helpful. And Adam, if I might come to you on a similar point, is your sense actually that the lack of controls in the pandemic is damping down some of the problems, and actually we're going to see a series of cliff edges over the next few months as things come into force, or actually the pandemic moves away and we try and get back to new business conditions, and business is going to take a series of further kicks both in the UK and the EU from this deal, or are you comfortable with where the UK is in terms of its preparedness?
Well, no, I'm not comfortable at all. The infrastructure required on the UK side to bring in the remaining import checks isn't ready, nor are the procedures and processes that go with them. And one of the questions that I ask repeatedly in all of my engagements with the UK government is to understand the detailed process flow for each type of check and who has responsibility at each moment in time, so that ultimately we can troubleshoot business issues as they arise, as these different systems go live. Unsurprisingly, I haven't had what I've asked for in that respect, because businesses require clarity and certainty. Even small delays for some cause enormous issues. And if you've got a situation where a worker at the gate of a port doesn't let a shipment go, the knock-on effects, particularly across the short straits, but not exclusively, are tremendous. So I'm not comfortable with where we are either on infrastructure or on the processes on the UK side. That being said, I don't think traders on either side are particularly well prepared. Many are having a very steep and sharp learning curve on the paperwork that they need to prepare. I've lost count of the number of cases on the UK side of businesses who say, oh, I import stuff from China, but it's coming from the UK then into EU countries. Why am I now having all this extra paperwork and all these tariffs to pay and everything else? And you have to explain patiently over and over again that the good doesn't originate in the UK and doesn't meet the rules of origin. You're not going to qualify for the zero tariff provisions. Now, on things like that, that is where honesty and clarity from UK government is very important in communicating out to businesses. If you tell people that we have a zero tariff, zero quota deal, they will think it is precisely that: zero tariff, zero quotas. I can move whatever I want. If you tell them we have a zero tariff, zero quota deal if the goods are produced entirely in the UK or substantially transformed in the UK, very different kettle of fish. So once again, I come back to my communication point. A lot of the difficulties and issues we're seeing at the border have at their root either poor communication or poor project management around getting the processes and the infrastructure right.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And do you have a sense of where the straw that's going to break the camel's back is? By which I mean these new checks, this new paperwork, these new costs, significant numbers of companies are going to turn away from trade. Do you think we're heading towards that place now, or I'm getting a very strong sense that you do, Adam?
Yeah, it's already happening, but it's happening at a small scale all across the country and all across the continent. A lot of smaller firms who only ever traded with the EU are making choices about whether it's still viable for them to trade across borders, given the erosion of margins and the enhanced costs that they're currently facing, or not. Businesses make these choices every day. The general public only tends to see this when it's a major household name or a multinational PLC making decisions about the future of an investment and the hundreds or thousands of jobs that go with those investments. But this is happening all across the country right now. And the reorientation of trade or a shift away from certain markets is happening too. Some businesses are agile and moving their trade elsewhere to other countries. And what I find very interesting is the number of companies who say to us now, it's easier for me to go into markets anywhere else around the world where I've known what I've been doing for a very, very long time than it is to move stuff into the EU. And I said, well, why is that the case if basically you're dealing with the same sorts of things? You're dealing with customs procedures, you're dealing with rules of origin, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They say, no, it's different. It's even harder. And I'm interested in getting to the bottom of why that's the case and whether there is something going on right now in these processes that makes it that much more difficult. But it's definitely changing business behavior.
I think that's right. And I'm just writing down, is there a question of Her Majesty's government having gold-plated its new processes once free from the EU regulatory orbit? I can imagine very little more ironic. Charles, and turning back to the view from the continent a little bit more again, is this reparable in a decent time frame? I mean, you talked about 2 years earlier on. Do you think that there is a desire to make what probably is the more commercially sensible decisions work, or do you think this view that the single market must predominate and maybe Brexit needs to be seen as a less successful endeavour, probably to keep the single market together? Do you think that will still tend to drive the decisions, or actually do you think we might move into a less politicised, more economically sensible place?
I think the Commission certainly hopes for the latter. Many governments do. The trouble is we used to have a lot of friends on the EU, the Dutch, the Swedes, the Danes, the Irish, and some of the Poles, the Hungarians. They were people who tended to think like the British did on some issues at least. Most of those so-called friends aren't really friends anymore. If you go, the Netherlands now is quite hostile to the UK on many of the issues we've been talking about. They're so concerned to protect the integrity of the single market. The Irish are potentially our friends and in a way have to be our friends, but we've kicked them in the teeth, at least as far as they're concerned, by these unilateral actions. So I think the EU is potentially willing to be more more pragmatic and look for ways of easing the burden. But they do need to see a change of attitude on the UK side. They do need to see a more pragmatic Britain, a Britain that cares about it. I mean, let me just, one little anecdote. We had a seminar last autumn with one of Barnier's most senior deputies, who said to us, look, when you go into number 10 and talk to the guys there about the Brexit talks, but what is weird is they just don't care about the economics. They're so obsessed with the Court of Justice, rules, regulations, sovereignty. They don't seem to, they're almost indifferent to whether the economic impact of the different sorts of deal could have on the UK economy. And I think the truth is that's a very strange attitude for a British government to take, especially for a Tory party to take, which has been, you know, close to big business ever since the days of Robert Peel, 220 years, 230 years ago. I think at some point the Tory party will become closer to business again. It'll become more focused on economics. The fact that they've won the argument on sovereignty, Brexit's happening, it's a hard Brexit, they got what they wanted. They just need to relax and then focus on pragmatic improvement of the deal so that businesses are less badly affected than they are at the moment.
Thank you. I think that's absolutely right. And I'm not sure this is quite the place for discussion of agricultural free trade and Robert Peel, but I think that the parallel is absolutely apposite. And Dan, in terms of Belgian businesses, and we've had a really interesting question, which I've been sitting on for a little while, but I think now is a good time. And some of our members are telling us, and this is coming in, that there's this sense that the UK government's done Brexit, it's our problem, and therefore UK businesses have to clean up the mess in those individual trade deals. I suppose it'd be perfectly understandable. Is that an attitude you're seeing, or at the business decision level, are people being more pragmatic?
Well, I think, I mean, you remember sort of Belgian companies and other companies around Europe are also used to trading with third countries around the rest of the world. And what, from their perspective, all that's happened is the UK has moved from single market into a third country category. So therefore, you know, from their perspective, it's sort of the UK and the UK companies that need to align with the new rules rather than a huge amount of change from their side. Now, I do think, of course, that's, again, because the UK import rules are, and particularly at customs, are laxer at the moment than they will eventually be once the UK moves to the full regime. So maybe an impact on Belgium isn't being seen, and other European countries isn't necessarily being seen immediately. But I think most of the Belgian companies that I talk to are still selling into the UK. They're still able to sell into the UK. It's a little bit more expensive for them, but at the moment, they're not seeing a huge change. So I think in answer to your question at the moment, effectively, yes, to the inference you were saying, that I think their view is that it's sort of for the UK and UK companies to have to deal with whatever the fallout is.
I'm not doing very well at asking questions where I'm hoping for a really cheering answer and getting a difficult one, but I guess that is just the lot of the panel chair. We are coming a little bit hard under time pressure, so brilliant has been discussion. So I'm going to ask the panelists just to sum up in a bit. But I think first we're going to have one more question for you, Adam, if that's okay. I think we've still got time for that, and then we'll come to Charles for the summary, or starting the summary. And that is around this question, as you talk to businesses and they're really concerned, they're seeing this massive paperwork, it's not really working and people are turning away. This government, I think most governments want more trade. It makes sense. It is the raison d'etre of the Chambers network. Actually, we were originally founded as a trading type endeavor, and that's a really core part of our work. It's even more crucial now because we've had the pandemic. We're in a really difficult place and we need to trade our way out of it. What adjustments do you think are needed to get us into that place, or do you actually think that we just have to accept it's not going to happen and focus on economic growth domestically as we look towards the future a little bit?
I think the biggest adjustment that needs to happen is at Westminster, where people need to stop thinking about trade as some sort of abstract thing that comes out in headline GDP and national accounts figures, and start thinking about trade as a very real world process with lots of moving parts, where it's very easy to get things wrong and it's very easy for some of those parts to break and for the whole system to stop working. The minute that our political leaders start realizing that, thinking about that, engaging with the detailed process and procedural issues that are causing problems, I think the more likely we are to see a more pragmatic approach and a more conciliatory approach emerge. Unfortunately, I see no evidence of that at the moment. If the government believes that simply signing free trade deals with countries, free trade agreements rather, with countries all around the world is the solution to all of our problems, they've forgotten the fact that it's governments that sign international agreements, but it's businesses that ultimately trade. And they need to make sure that the pathways, processes, and procedures for businesses to do that actually work. Right now, we are seeing real issues in this early teething phase of the TCA. As many of those issues as possible do need to be addressed. And as colleagues have said throughout the course of our conversation today, that only will happen on the basis of greater trust. And we've got to get to a position of greater trust quickly if we are to see those trade pathways stabilized and ultimately improved.
Fantastic, thank you. Definitely companies, not governments trade. I think that's probably one of the takeaways. So it's been fantastic. We've come to the end of the Q&A section. Thank you all for your answers and the expertise. It's been hugely interesting for me, and I'm sure for the audience. I'm just going to ask everyone to sum up, maybe give us 1 or 2 minutes of thoughts for the future. Maybe we can take some positivity away on what's quite a dank Tuesday afternoon in London. I'm going to carry on the order we've kind of been following. So I'm going to come to Charles first. Charles, your thoughts and views and suggestions, and if you can make me smile, that's a definite win. But don't.
I'll try to, James. I hope we can first say on the negative side. I hope we can avoid a Swiss scenario. The very good Swiss ambassador to London likes to say that at the time the Swiss voted in a referendum on should they join the European Economic Area in 1992, nearly half the Swiss wanted to join the EU at that point. They voted very narrowly not to join the EEA. Today, the figure is just over 10%. The reason the Swiss have turned off the EU in the last 40 years is because they've been negotiating non-stop with a much bigger partner who's sometimes a bit arrogant, sometimes a bit of a bully, who doesn't always treat them with great kindness. And so the Swiss have been turned off from the EU. And I do hope we avoid that, because I think in the long run, we all agree we need a positive and constructive relationship between the UK and the EU, where the two populations have perhaps more, genuine respect and liking for each other. So I hope we avoid the Swiss scenario. Second point, to repeat something I said earlier, security cooperation may seem to be not of great relevance to most members of the BCC, but actually it's all connected up. And I think this is something that the EU wants out of the UK. Britain contributes outlandishly to European security through its big armed forces and its diplomacy and its counter-terrorist capabilities and so on. That is something the EU wants. It wants us to be plugged in to make Europe stronger. It's something Joe Biden wants, by the way. And if we offer something there, which we've not done at all, at least not to a large extent, then I think that would create a lot of goodwill, which would help to get the EU to give us some of the things that we want, which we've all discussed, like mutual recognition of professional qualifications, for example, and so on. So let's think about linking security to economics. And the third and obvious point to make, I think we all agree, is we need to break out of the current vicious spiral and get into a virtuous spiral. It's very simple. The UK, for its part, has to convince the EU it's serious about implementing the Northern Ireland Protocol, and it will stand by it and respect international law. And if it does that, and it's so far not doing that, the EU will be much more willing to give the kind of easements and improvements to the details of how the deal works than it is so far. That's a virtuous circle. Let's hope we can get there.
Thank you, Charles. I think that's right. And security cooperation, incredibly important. Theresa May, I believe, tried to use it as a bargaining chip. Perhaps now is the time to use it in a more sensitive, grown-up way. Not that I'm pointing any fingers at anyone. I think that would make a lot of sense, and it would be good to add our strength to the EU's more generally on that one, where of course we all benefit. Not that the BCC has an expertise, but perhaps in a past life these are some of the sentiments we might have thought through. Daniel, over to you. Concluding remarks, please. Again, the same request. If you can make us happy, give us a sense of hope for the future, that would be wonderful. But please don't bend things too far.
Well, I'm gonna be positive and negative, because I think I think there's 3 key things that will dictate what happens from now. One is movement of people when COVID is over, and suddenly real people start facing the same barriers that our goods are facing at the moment in a variety of areas. And I think when that feeds in to across people in general, I think that there'll start being some calls or demands domestically for a better deal with the EU on that side. I don't actually agree with Charles on the Northern Ireland Protocol, though. My reading of this is I don't think the protocol is stable. And I don't think it's stable, actually, whatever the UK government does, because I think of the effect on the unionist community in Northern Ireland. I think that's what will dictate whether it survives or not. And I think the EU actually might need to bend first on some of the import rules on food to ensure that the effect on the unionist community there isn't too big, so big that we start seeing that sort of falling apart. On the plus side, what I also think is likely to happen is I do think the UK will go away and try and sign agreements with third countries, and I think it will get some agreements with some third countries, but I don't think those agreements will necessarily change food standards, for example, in the UK very much. I just don't think that the government is going to be able to get that through, given that most of those changes will probably be quite unpopular. So I think actually the UK has given itself quite a lot of room to negotiate away some of those standards but actually it won't need to. And I think those three things coming together actually mean that you can then come back and negotiate an agreement that still covers all of the government's red lines, but actually gets us a bit closer on a business side. So that would be my pitch. One other just thing I would say as well on this is, the single market itself is not as strong as I think sometimes you hear from European politicians. I was on the single market committee in the European Parliament for years, and not once did a national government talk about how great the single market was. Every day they were trying to undermine it with laws that would keep out other European people or goods. So and we're already seeing there's lots of stuff happening at national level that infringes on the single market. And the question is, how strong is the European Commission in keeping that single market strong? Because there's a danger, I think, that it erodes without the UK there sort of pushing the Commission to make sure that it deals with it. So I think there's lots of ways this could go. It's not all potentially negative. I still think there's scope for a closer relationship, even with the current government and the current leadership in Europe.
Fabulous, Daniel. I'm afraid we've run out of time to put that one back to Charles. We'll have to leave that dangling in the air, but it's certainly a very interesting point. And finally, from our panelists, of course, Adam, your final thoughts on this discussion, please.
I think, first of all, there are some elements of the TCA that we need to go back and use. There are a ton of specialized committees that are due to be set up, where people in business, where people in civil society, and all of those of us who want the relationship between the UK and the EU to work could have some influence. So those of us who are pragmatists, who are practical, who dislike the political peacocking that we're seeing at the moment, we need to look at how we use the architecture that's been put in place to our advantage to try to see if we can force governments and the Commission into doing things a little bit differently to our mutual benefit. I think it's the common sense and the shared interests of businesses and civil society organizations in the UK and the EU that can ultimately get some change to both the tone and the relationship that we've got. So my optimistic note to finish on would be, we need to exercise our voice and use it well over the coming months.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Adam. And of course, thank you to Dan and Charles. It's been absolutely fascinating. This is the last of our book series of webinars around the TCA, although there is the potential that we will restart them in a couple of months when, perhaps in a slightly different capacity, we would love to have each of our three panelists today back in one way or another. Adam can give us his post-leaving the BCC views as well. I'd just like to say thank you to the team that have produced and delivered these, particularly Julia, who has worked tirelessly and been a superb moderator and influence around this, and has cajoled many panelists, including our current three, to come on. It's not been a particularly easy task to get this up and running very quickly. So thank you, Julia. Thank you to all our colleagues in the Chamber Network who have also been instrumental in delivering this, and of course to the many members and companies who join in, ask us questions, give me things to probe the panelists with. It's always the fun bit. I think we'd all agree that actually we only have a platform because of you. We only know what to ask about, to press, to think about, to research because of what you tell us. Just summarising the conversation today, I think it's been absolutely fascinating. I think it's clear there are some pretty knotty issues that need to be resolved. There needs to be a sense of a bedrock of trust between the EU and the UK, and arguably between the member states, the EU and the UK as well. It's clearly not quite there at this stage. There are otherwise we will end up in a persistent relationship where things will happen that actually have to be dealt with in a really tricky, hard-edged way. And we've heard around vaccine politics, and we've also heard around the NI protocol how difficult that is. If we can turn those into useful things that will help us to improve, then that would be excellent. And some of the other thoughts I've noted down, it's companies that trade rather than governments. Wheeling around the world, creating trade deals is incredibly important, but if the companies can't follow that path, it doesn't work. If the systems aren't in place, it doesn't work. So there needs to be a real focus on delivering those systems that really work. And then at policy level, we've outlined some of the absolutely key things that need to build up around equivalence, around mobility, around qualifications, and around conformity. And I don't think anyone would argue on those. Thinking back to past webinars as well, I think we'd all like to see the UK government take a look at how it has done things around rules of origin and VAT. Even within the structure of the deal, have we gold-plated? Have we gone too far? Is the paperwork just not worth the candle? Because that's some of the thing we've said. If these can be made to work, the prize is incredibly valuable. It's an export-led recovery. It's more prosperity. It's more ideas. It is truly a global Britain, and that's all we want. If we can't, but I have every hope that we can, then we're in for a rockier time than any of us hope. It's been an incredibly valuable and interesting 2.5 months worth of webinars for me. We've had some superb debates, discussions, answers and questions. And as ever, we very much rely on the panelists. So to Adam, to Daniel and to Charles, I'd like to say thank you. And to everyone else, I'd like to say good afternoon. And if you have any detailed questions around trade, I would naturally and absolutely recommend the huge oasis of expertise in your accredited UK Chamber of Commerce or your global business network chamber, not least the Belgian one. Thanks to everyone, and bye-bye.